stuff. I'll just make a start. So firstly, thanks to Prasad and to Professor Sharma and to Flame for hosting the conference. And thanks to Deepak Sir and Pranab and the rest of the Landstack team, Richa, Aman, for the logistics coordination. It's been very smooth, so well done to all of you. So my name is Serene Ho, and I do apologize for the more than 10-year-old photograph that was used and the fact that this title does not correspond to the one on the program. And to make matters worse, I'm now going to have to shorten the presentation drastically. So I feel I've engaged you in a bit of a false relationship from the start, but never mind. So I think firstly, just to start, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and we recognize that they've never ceded their sovereignty. I also would like to pay my respects to all the Indigenous peoples represented in the room today, and acknowledge their strength, their wisdom, and their struggles for self-determination. So I recognize as well that the disciplines of surveying and spatial has always played a role in dispossessing Indigenous peoples. And the university commits through our research and teaching to support our reconciliation actions wherever we can. So this presentation really today, I was given a bit of homework by Pranab, but really what I'm trying to do with this presentation is share with you some of the research we were commissioned to do by the World Bank around climate action and access to land. And after doing that research, it gave me a lot of headaches. So I want to share some of those headaches with you and hopefully end the presentation with something for you to chew on and for us to engage in more conversation over the next couple of days. So for those who don't know, just the nationally determined contributions are every country's roadmap to meeting the global goals of the Paris Agreement. So we've got about 179 parties, and next year all countries will submit their updated NDCs. So these are 5 yearly documents. Has anyone in this room read your country's nationally determined contribution report? Anyone read the NDC? 1? 2? Oh, it's not looking good. Anyone then has contributed to their country's NDC? Okay, all right, that's kind of good to know. I would encourage you to have a look as well. India's one is very short, it's only 4 pages, so there's no excuse. So what we know so far is in 2022 and updated in 2023, colleagues from the University of Melbourne at the Melbourne Climate Future Centre worked on this land gap report with 20 other colleagues around the world, and they estimated, just based on carbon dioxide renewal activities, that all the pledges in these NDCs all these pledges across the NDCs based on reforestation, afforestation, and restoration would result, half of these would result in land use change amounting to about 1 billion hectares, or four times the size of India. And so when we looked at the NDCs for the countries in South Asia region and East Asia and Pacific, it's about 44 countries that we had data for from the Climate Watch portal. We combed through about 13,000 rows of data manually, and we found that we estimated that maybe around 1 in 2 climate actions relate to land. And here we make a distinction about direct land, which means it will likely result in land use change, or it would likely result in changing existing access to land and resources. And then other land would be secondary activities like planning, so on and so forth. So we found that around, it's kind of about half and half across mitigation and adaptation. In South Asia, which you'd be probably more interested in, there was a slightly higher percentage of these actions that would result in direct land impacts. And you can see how that shapes around the region as well with the data. So we're looking at, when we look at the countries in South Asia a little bit more closely, you can start to see that some countries have more actions in their NDCs that will result in direct land impacts. Countries like Bangladesh, India mainly because of the big afforestation commitment or reforestation commitment. But, you know, everyone's got quite a significant task ahead of them of trying to find this land. Importantly, most of these actions that need land will relate to just 5 sectors: agriculture, energy, forestry, transport, and the environment. And that is, you know, some examples of what those actions look like in the NDCs are listed here. I'll let you read them. But they mostly involve things like new infrastructure for renewable or clean energy, new roads to create public infrastructure, forest cover, of course, and land use change for agricultural purposes. Similarly, for adaptation, you start to see agriculture really come into play with trying to shift towards new types of systems, but also protected areas, restoration actions. These all have really big land implications, and we're conscious that these are all areas that local communities rely on for their livelihoods. So when the land gap data itself did this based on the carbon dioxide renewal activities. So they found that as a percentage, so they calculated the percentage of those activities as a share of total land area. And you can see for South Asia region, you're hovering around in that 5 to 10% region. But when we looked at the data that we had, and we looked carefully at all other activities, we tried to quantify and we struggled a little. And you can see how few actions we found that had some kind of description that we could conservatively apply a quantification to. And so for India, we found about 6 actions, but those 6 actions alone translates to a possible need for about 42 million hectares, which is about 13% of your land area. So that's quite a scary relationship. It's 6, but you've kind of got 43 million in there. So when we're looking at these climate actions, what we're looking at is this cascade of global to national decisions, right, that's coming down to the ground. So we really, as the theme of the conference suggests, we're really interested in what this means right at that lowest scale, which is for local communities. And so the work kind of has really got me thinking about, well, what's going on? Like, how do we deal with this? How do we think about this? So I think, you know, this relationship, the relationships up there will be pretty familiar to all of you. It's kind of how we've been trained to think about tenure and tenure systems, land tenure systems. We look at relationships, we try to codify rights within our frameworks, whether it's statutory or customary frameworks. We use land administration systems to manage this information, and we really have become quite focused on ownership rights. But when we talk about climate and socio-ecological relationships, we're really also talking about not just land, but land resources. And I know land often is used to wrap around all other types of ecological resources, but in this case, I think it's important to make that distinction because of the paradigm we use. So here, we're really interested in users and the relationship with resources, and we tend to think about them as how they use resources for benefit. And these are often located within normative tenure systems, and they're really shaped by local conditions. But we don't have this as part of our training. We don't have this really as part of our discourse, especially in the land administration discipline. So, and also what we're kind of confronting, I think, is the fact that we're training and proliferating ideas that mainstream simple instrumental systems for the purpose of having stable, efficient bureaucracies. And there's nothing wrong about that. But when we come to climate action and trying to find land, we're really confronting very complex realities that exist and are dynamic and shift all the time to ensure that people can subsist and live and flourish. So this is where climate actions start to bring together kind of two quite different ways of thinking about land and resources. And unfortunately, I think this is where we're kind of encountering a system failure. We don't quite have the right, it's not that we don't have the right tools and ideas, it's that they exist across different disciplines, and the disciplines aren't really talking to each other. And so that's a little bit problematic. So I think, what we can gather from what's been going on and the recent COP16 is that I don't think none of us will be shocked to say that outcomes are poor for many local communities. We have high rates and growing rates of deaths of environmental defenders. We continue to exclude Indigenous peoples from the table and give them equal standing in high-level decisions. And the data collected by Land Matrix has shown that the number of land deals across the world, especially related to agriculture, has been growing. And I point you to the fabulous work that the Land Conflict Watch colleagues do, gathering data on land conflicts in India, if you wanted to know what's happening here as well. So I guess in relationship to how I've been trying to think about this, and trying to question my own training, is through work I've been involved with for the last 4 years in the Pacific. So just give you a very simple example. In the Solomon Islands, the capital city is Honiara. Around half of Honiara's residents live informally. But even within this concept of informality, there are many types of informality. There can be ownership of land, so ownership is in play, but it's land that's informally subdivided by the family. Groups of families can hold a collective lease that's legal, but the owners might not be updated. And there's also arrangements to rent land from customary landowners. So there are different rights and ownership models and use models that dictates what and who benefits from climate actions. But also, in relation to women and land and resources, in Honiara and in the Pacific, gardens have always been a way of gaining and maintaining access to land. So planting urban gardens are a way to claim land, and if that doesn't get destroyed, you can build a house, and if that house doesn't get destroyed, you can build a more permanent structure. And these acts, accessing gardens can be through kind of recognized ways like negotiation, but it can also be through illicit acts like, just stealing somebody else's garden. And so we see people doing different and executing different strategies to ensure that they are able to maintain certain benefits for themselves and their families. So I guess the question is, and this is a question that isn't new, it's a question that legal geographers and other anthropologists have thought about for a long time. But this is a question I think that people in land administration or land probably need to think about a bit more explicitly, which is, do we need to think about more than rights in land and resource tenure systems? And what does that mean for land administration systems? And so the question I've been thinking about is, should we be thinking about this in terms of benefits and burdens, which is where the principle of justice and just transitions are starting to talk about. So I think, firstly, the ideas that I've been tossing out in my head are not new ideas. They're ideas that have been raised by people, even people back, a really seminal paper back in 1997 about women, men, and trees, based on research in East Africa, shows us that, for a long time, ownership doesn't align to nested rights and overlapping rights. And many people don't own land, but can use land and benefit from it. So in each of these circles, we have different disciplines already working in them. We tend to work in the bundle of rights space. Political scientists tend to work in the bundle of powers space. And the bundle of owners and users tend to be split across many different disciplines. I guess what I've been trying to think through, and I invite you all to kind of cast aspersions, be critical, and engage in this kind of, how can we think about tenure transitions? What are the ideas we should be having in our back pocket? Is that when I look at the NDC data, it's very clear that climate action is prescribing external impacts on local communities. And communities are having to deal with many tensions and trade-offs based on things that they had no say in. So this is kind of the system we are now involved in and working in. And this could be, and this also draws on the theory of access work that has been around since 2007 and that continues to hold up pretty well. And it's trying to think through, how can we use this and how can we connect with these concepts so that we can engage in thinking about these issues at different spatial scales and different temporal scales, because we now are also confronting the issue of reparation for future generations. And so I was chatting with Shivanji this morning as well, and we're talking about this term benefits. And I think we have used benefits, tossed it around pretty loosely. And I think if we use something like this to inform our work, there is a really key piece of work at the start in interrogating and defining what that benefit is and what it is for. Otherwise, we run the risk of producing murky kind of insights. And it's about understanding, scaling back up and understanding how these benefits translate across scales and what that means. And I think the key part in all this is that we need to do more of this research with other disciplines so that we can gather the evidence to inform the next round of NDCs. Because these NDCs are not being written based on a lot of land evidence and tenure evidence, and that's really, really troubling. So I'm going to leave you with this question, and a bit of homework for all of you is to maybe find a colleague from a discipline at afternoon tea and talk about this, and see kind of how ideas converge or don't. And we talk in our profession, we talk a lot about the land question, which has always been a question about redistribution. So maybe the question for you is, at the scale and within the systems that you work in, what is the land question you should engage with in this time of climate crisis? And what does this mean in the language of your discipline? And what does this mean in the language of your practice area? And is this understandable to somebody else in another discipline and in another practice area? Because if we don't kind of collaborate better, we're not going to get the answers we need to drive a better future. And the last thing I'm going to do, because I've been given this soapbox, is to encourage all the researchers out there to really prioritize a return of research to the communities. I don't think it's not something we train scholars to do very well, but I think you should all, at the very least, try to do a one-pager of your research outcomes in the local language and give that back to the communities and spend an hour or so talking them through what you found so that they can use that to advocate on their own behalves. And that is the end of my soapbox. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.